I think one of the hallmarks of a truly great diplomat is the ability to take the lessons that you've learned and apply them in new and uncharted areas or new and different conflicts. And certainly by that standard, Jim counts as one of our truly great diplomats. Along the way, he developed a very deep appreciation for the role of Congress and public opinion in the shaping of our foreign policy, a very keen observer of presidential management styles and Secretary of State, the cost to us of our rather unique style of transition of government, and presidential and cabinet learning curves on how to respond to and shape events globally. Jim is also a recognized expert on nation building, both the successful and the unsuccessful attempts that we have been involved in over decades. And if you want to just check, you know, the designation of expert, go on Amazon Books and put in Jim Dobbins' name, and there must be 10 books on nation building for good or ill, spanning Germany all the way to Afghanistan. A career of 50 years that spans these kinds of issues in so many different places. His memoir really should be, you know, Kissingerian in its multiple volumes. I do know that there was somebody who worked for 2 years as part of the Bush administration that when he left wrote a 900-page memoir. I'm not sure how much of it was any good, but he managed to spend, you know, let's see, that would be more than a page a day. Jim's could easily and probably more productively be equally long, but he somehow manages to bring all of this down to a very accessible, readable, entertaining, and illuminating 300 pages. And he's agreed this afternoon to talk with us about the lessons learned, about his career, giving back to a next generation of policymakers, and as a BSFS alum, basically talking to himself several decades back. So I think I'll go straight into some questions.
Yeah, please.
Okay. I think the first one I'd like to ask is, I'm pretty sure it's the one that's on the minds of most of our students, is what do you think it takes to become or to be an effective diplomat? Are these talents that we're born with? Are these things that we can learn in school? Or is it something that you grow into over the years?
Probably some combination of the three. It's certainly something you can learn. I think when I joined the Foreign Service, graduate school was unusual, and most people came directly out of undergraduate school. I had come out of 3 years in the Navy. A few people in my entry class had gone to the Peace Corps for a year or two, and others had come directly undergraduate school. And so, you know, and the Foreign Service was pretty good about not sending you anywhere you knew anything about, which I think they probably still continue. So, and so you very much learned, you know, on the job, moving, you know, up through the hierarchy as time went by, and learning your profession by watching people a few years older than you do it, and then doing it yourself. I mean, the qualities, it takes a certain degree of empathy. You have to understand why other people do things, and why they're behaving the way they are, and what might change them, what might get them to change their behavior. So partially it's understanding enough about personality and having enough of a feel, establishing a rapport even with somebody who's in an adversarial position, so that you establish a degree of at least situational trust, and some commonality of, you know, you're in a negotiation, probably both of our careers will be enhanced if we succeed in this negotiation. So what do you need to succeed? Here's what I need to succeed. And how can we move our respective governments toward so the other thing is, first, so parts of it's interpersonal. The other is bureaucratic. I mean, first of all, even with modern diplomacy and the internet and ability to travel so much. I mean, when I joined the Foreign Service, people still took boats across the Atlantic.
And the Pacific.
Yeah, and the Pacific. It's still, you know, on the one hand, it's made, you know, it's all people, and so decisions are made by people. Secondly, they're all bureaucrats. And so they're all operating within a bureaucratic environment. And so they're all operating with bureaucratic constraints. So understanding, and each of those bureaucracies is somewhat unique. And so understanding how bureaucracy acts, whether it's China or the Soviet Union or Germany or the UK, you know, understanding enough about that bureaucracy so that you understand, again, why it's doing the things you're doing, and again, understanding what are the pressure points which would lead it to change its behavior. What are the arguments that would be compelling within the framework of that bureaucracy, and who do you need to talk to, and who can you afford to ignore within that bureaucracy. So it's that combination of things. And of course, a lot, you know, careers also depend a lot on just luck, just being in the right place in the right time.
Right. Actually, you just kind of came into my second question, which is in reading through your career, a lot of your assignments seem to be serendipitous. Sometimes as a result of an assignment you thought you were going to have being blocked, and an opportunity then opening up. I know when I've sometimes talked with some students, and they have this idea of a 5-year plan, a 10-year plan, a 15-year plan, and said yours is opportunities arose just by chance. How much can you really plan? How much of it is timing, and how much of it really is just dumb luck?
I think it's I mean, I think there are two factors. One is being in the right time in the right place.
Yeah.
And some of that is just luck. I'll give you a couple of examples. So, so my entry class had 50 people. It was the biggest class to that date that they ever had. And they told us at the beginning of the class that they weren't sending anybody to Vietnam. And then halfway through the class, they changed their mind. But they didn't tell anybody they changed their mind. And so at the end of the last day of the class, everybody gets their assignment. It's like a graduation. You know, you all have sit around, and somebody from management comes, and you go up one at a time and get your orders. And so person after person, you know, went up at Vietnam. And so about 20 of them went to Vietnam. And I went up, and they said, Paris. and a sort of a hush went through.
Yes. It's a very dangerous thing to happen.
What did he do to deserve this? Well, as it turned out, 40 years later, I happened to sit at a luncheon for retired foreign service officers. I happened to sit next to the fellow who had done my assignment. Okay. And it turned out that he, like I, was a former naval officer. And so my view is it was just, hey, this guy's just got a Navy, we'll send him to Paris.
Right.
And we'll send the rest of these guys to Vietnam. So then I was in Paris. I'd been there a few months. And Lyndon Johnson announced that he was first stepping down, not going to run again, and secondly, that he was inviting North Vietnam into negotiations. And so Averell Harriman and Cyrus Vance arrived in Paris to conduct negotiations with the North Vietnamese to end the war. And they needed a junior officer to staff them, and I was chosen for it. Pure luck. So that's kind of the luck part. And then the other is you have to perform well when you have that opportunity. And if you have that opportunity, particularly in a large mission or an influential mission, again, this is a matter of luck at the beginning, you know, then more and more people will say, yeah, he did this well, we've got another job, we need so-and-so, and you'll begin to be a known quality. One of the jobs I took, which was in retrospect rather dangerous, I had served in Paris and met my wife there, we got married, and a few years later I was offered another job in France that I could really impress the one person who was there. But no matter how good I was, he was the only person I was going to impress. And he was only about 3 or 4 years longer in the service than I was. And so this was, could have been, a dead time where you made no new contacts. You created no new reputation. And so partially it's luck, partially it's a combination of luck and talent. You can't just be lucky.
Right.
But also you can be just talented and not lucky and not have a successful career.
It's a combination, as you said, of when you get the opportunity, having the qualifications to be able to do something with it. You mentioned two-person posts. I've always been amazed at Tom Pickering, who probably has the most studying career of almost anybody. Started his career at a two-man post in, I think, Mombasa.
Yeah.
And all I can think of is that he might have only impressed one person, but he obviously would have done one hell of a job.
Yeah.
I think one of the more interesting elements of your career, maybe because it was completely out of my region, as discussed in your book, was the work that you were doing in Bonn at the time of German unification, and then how that played into the European community becoming the European Union. Now, with everything that is going on in the world and what's going on in Europe in particular, and between Europe and us, could you reflect a little bit on that time, and why did it work as well as it did? What were the factors and who were the personalities that allowed both the fall of the Soviet Union, the unification of Germany, and then the stepping up of the EU to work in retrospect so smoothly, and clearly not as smoothly at the time?
Well, personally, as regards myself, it was again a question of being at the right place at the right time. So I had been the deputy chief of mission in Bonn, which was the capital of Germany at the time, for 4 years, and came back to Washington to be the number 2 in the European Bureau. And I had only been back a few weeks when the Berlin Wall fell, and German unification suddenly became not an empty talking point, but an actual operational priority. And there were lots of people in the Foreign Service who knew more about Germany than I did, but none of them were in Washington. They were all somewhere else. And so I was the most senior person in the U.S. government who was in Washington who had any experience with Germany. And so, I mean, I was also in a position where it was logical to have something to do with it, but it was really the background and the fact that I had that background at that particular moment, at that particular time, that allowed me to have access to Jim Baker and George H.W. Bush that I wouldn't have had just by virtue of the position. And so that from a personal standpoint. Now, I think this was true also in terms of why was the process so successful. It was so successful in large measure because of the personalities. In the U.S. case, because George H.W. Bush was president of the United States, he had just taken over only a few months earlier, but he had been first a war hero in the Second World War, and secondly, he had been ambassador to the UN. He had been ambassador to China. He had been head of the CIA, and then he'd been vice president for 8 years, during which he had a lot of international responsibilities and experience. So, since at least really Dwight Eisenhower, he was the most experienced president we had in the 20th century, and so could pick up immediately. Jim Baker had been White House Chief of Staff, Secretary of the Treasury, and perhaps most importantly, George H.W. Bush's campaign manager. And so he had a unique relationship with the president. There was no contest. He didn't have to fight off the Defense Department or worry about some other presidential advisor getting in his way. I mean, he had complete access and complete confidence of the president. And of course, probably most importantly, you had Mikhail Gorbachev, without which none of this would have happened. And in fact, it's not clear that those unique American qualities did more than smooth the process that might have occurred anyway, simply because of Gorbachev. So a lot of the credit for German unification and for subsequent events, goes to Gorbachev. Now, in terms of the Soviet population or Russian population, it's largely blame rather than credit, but still, he deserves a lot of credit. The dynamics of it were that the U.S. I think was certainly in advance of everyone else, maybe even of the Germans, in appreciating that this was now a real possibility. I had sent Baker a memo several weeks before the war went down, saying, that while this wasn't imminent, it turned out to be wrong, it was imminent, but while it wasn't imminent, it was a lot more a real prospect than anybody had ever thought or currently thought. And others in the department put notes on it, saying nonsense, so I felt we were intellectual, and we saw it almost immediately as an opportunity rather than a disaster or a challenge, something we didn't like. Whereas I think the British, the French, the Europeans initially saw this as a problem. They liked Germany so much they wanted several of them, and saw a united Germany with 80 million people a challenge to them. And so the process was driven largely by Helmut Kohl on one hand, who also deserves a lot of credit, obviously, and the U.S. on the other. And among the other things that Baker did was to urge the European, what was then the European community, subsequently became the European Union, to also take advantage of this. The idea was that if you're going to have a big Germany that left alone would dominate Europe, the better thing was to embrace it, to first of all keep it in NATO, and secondly to involve it even more deeply in a European integration process. And so the Maastricht Treaty, which first of all secured agreement to a common currency, the euro, and transferred the European Community, the European Union, emerged from the process that Baker urged and the Europeans. Jacques Delors was the president of the European Commission, and Helmut Kohl all grabbed and saw this as a way to reassure France, Britain, and the other Europeans that Germany was going to be a good European and not dominate the continent, and you weren't going to return to the geopolitics of the First or Second World War.
I think there's obviously a number of times in your career where your analysis, your recommendations, based on your experience, proved very right and very useful.
Those are the ones I mentioned before.
Yes. So that's what I'm going to ask you about, what you didn't talk about in the book. What are kind of the two sides of also operating in the government? Is either not having your perfect analysis and your great recommendations followed, and then having to watch sometimes the fallout from that. What happens when the bureaucratic decisions go against you? And maybe one or two examples of when, in retrospect, you might have been wrong.
Yeah, I'll have to think about when I was wrong. And there's certainly instances where they didn't take my advice.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll probably come up with two as well. But so the major issue where there are several points where I diverged from the administration. One was shortly after unification and the beginning of the Warsaw Pact to dissolve, Yugoslavia began to come apart, and thought this was quite likely to lead to violence, conflict, and conflicts that would eventually draw the United States in. And I urged Baker and his inner circle to take this more seriously. And so we had several small meetings with Baker and Bob Zellick, who was one of the undersecretaries, Larry Eagleberger, who was the deputy secretary. Eagleberger had been ambassador to Yugoslavia, and he served there earlier in his career as a junior officer. And so he knew everything about Yugoslavia. And after every one of these meetings, I would be urging some greater involvement of the administration, not military. This was before the place had come apart, but it was where it was beginning to come apart. And Eagleberger would always say, "I'd recommend something," and Baker would look to Eagleberger, and Eagleberger would say, "No, it's the right policy, but it's not going to work." And after about the third time, Zellick just blew up, and he said, "Larry, you can't just keep saying it's the right policy, it's not going to work. You're the expert. Give us a policy that will work." But so my analysis was, if we didn't do something, Yugoslavia was going to break apart. It was going to ultimately spread from civil wars to international wars. The U.S. was ultimately going to be involved, so we ought to do something now. The analysis of Baker and others, I think, based on Skoproft, who was the National Security Advisor, was also a former Yugoslavian. He served there. And he, like Eagleberger, agreed that it was hopeless. And so, you had two views. One was, there's nothing we can do about it, and the other one is, if we don't do anything about it, it's going to turn bloody and highly regrettable. And we were both right. I mean, I was certainly right in predicting what was going to happen. They may have been right in the view that there was nothing we could have done. I argued we could have done more than we did do, and so the book goes on a bit about that. And I think there were a couple of places where a slightly different approach might have made a difference. I mean, the classic was when I told Baker that the German foreign minister was about to recognize Croatia as a country. And everybody at that point was saying, we're not going to recognize any of these breakaway states, and that'll keep a lid on the situation. So I said, if you do that, there's going to be fighting. Because there's a lot of Serbs who live in Croatia who don't want to live in an independent Croatia. And eventually it'll draw us in. And he said, well, no, you're exaggerating, Jim. And I said, no. And he said, okay, well, call the German political director, who was sort of my level, and tell him not to do it. And I said, well, it would be a lot more influential coming from you, Mr. Secretary. He said, no, you do it. So I called the German political director, and I told him that Secretary Baker had asked us to advise them not to do this. And I explained, why. And he said, oh, no, you're exaggerating, Jim. Pretty much the same thing that Baker had said. And so I rang off with sort of an angry statement that the one country in Europe that wasn't going to do anything to stop the war was the country that was going to start it. So, I mean, that's an example. I think an area where I may have been wrong, but we'll never know because they didn't take my advice, was shortly after German unification, in sort of the day after the wall fell, I sent Baker a short memo with 7 or 8 recommendations. And he checked them all off and wrote, Jim Baker, so I agree. And the recommendations probably are things he would have done anyway, but it was, I thought I'd done my job. So after German unification, I sent him another memo, what do we do now about the Soviet Union, which was still the Soviet Union at that point, and I argued for a much more substantial aid program to Gorbachev, and I never got a response. And we were doing some modest things. And I talked about this later to Bob Zellick, who was the Undersecretary for Economic Affairs, and who was heading that effort. And I talked to him more recently when I wrote the book. And his view was probably right, that the Soviet Union was simply too big for anything we could do to make much of a difference. And secondly, that since Gorbachev had not the faintest idea how to run a market economy, that nothing we would do would actually help them do the things they needed to do to move from the command economy that was running them into the ground to something more productive. And he was probably right.
It's a nice segue to my next question, which is, if there is kind of a theme throughout your career that bounces to virtually every continent, and certainly I think it accelerated towards in the latter years, is the work and the writings that you've done on nation building, a very poorly defined and poorly understood concept in the best of circumstances. Peaceful unification of Germany, possibly, if we want to talk about nation building, should we have done something for the Soviets? Haiti, Yugoslavia, Iraq, Afghanistan, on and on. Some of these have worked out better. Some of them have been debacled. What lessons have we learned? What lessons do we seem to be impervious to? And on the latter, is there any way of getting through 20, 30, 40 years of experience to the next generation? Either of policymakers, well, either students or policymakers.
Yeah, well, I think the answer is that there's lessons that we should have learned, lessons that individual administrations learned, but not much that was passed on from the administration. The whole nation-building paradigm, we've done it in Germany and Japan, it was very successful, but that was 40 years earlier. Nobody had any living memory of that. And in any case, those societies were rather different than the ones we were dealing with in the post-Cold War. During the Cold War, the U.S. invaded a new country about once every 10 years. And most of those were very short-lived. Grenada, Panama, Dominican Republic. We went into Lebanon twice, didn't stay very long. And so the nation-building paradigm that grew up in the 90s was new and much more frequent. So we went from once every 10 years to once every 2 years under Clinton. So Somalia, Haiti, Bosnia, Kosovo in 8 years. George W. Bush came into office saying he wasn't going to do this anymore, and he invaded 3 new countries in his first 3 years in office. Haiti we left almost immediately, but Iraq and Afghanistan have been with us ever since. So it became a much more common event, and the UN had a similar acceleration. So during the first 40 years, the UN opened a new peacekeeping operation once every 4 years. In the 1990s, they started a new peacekeeping operation, put troops in a new country every 6 months. And these were lasting 4 or 5 years. So by the end of the 90s, they were doing 20, 21 peacekeeping operations. And we, in 2004, we had troops in 5 different nation-building operations, all at once. Now, so the Clinton administration got better at this, as one would expect. It done 4 in an 8-year period. So Somalia was a complete debacle. No redeeming aspects other than what you could learn from it. Haiti was more successful. There was no resistance. We achieved everything we said we were going to achieve, but we left before we could have any enduring effect on the country. Clinton hadn't learned not to set departure deadlines in Bosnia, but he had learned not to keep it. And so he promised to be out in a year, and at the end of the year he admitted that there were many things we hadn't achieved, but we were going to stay till we did, and we stayed 10 years. And we still have troops in Kosovo today, and we went there in 99, so that's 18 years or so. So they got steadily better, and they learned certain lessons. I think one lesson was that going with a large force, larger than you probably need, in order to make your point, to deter the emergence of a violent resistance movement, and then scale back once you've made your point and established a secure environment. Secondly, the local institutions for law enforcement, civil order, are probably going to have collapsed or be so discredited by virtue of their behavior that you're not going to want to use them. You're going to have to police the place yourself until you can raise an indigenous force or bring in international police. And thirdly, you need to get the cooperation of the neighbors. If the neighbors don't like what you're doing, they'll sabotage it, and they'll be successful in sabotaging it. The Bush administration ignored all 3 of these lessons. Now, to be fair, the Clinton administration never wrote them down, never institutionalized them, and never became part of State Department on military doctrine. But if the Clinton administration had had another term, or if a Democrat had been elected, Al Gore, those lessons would have continued. Instead, you had George Bush, who in 4.5 hours of televised debate with Al Gore, the only foreign policy issue mentioned was nation building. To think about what a lovely time that was, for 4.5 hours of presidential debate, the only foreign policy issue of any consequence, whether we were to do more of these little tiny interventions or not. And he said we weren't. And so he came in with first not wanting to do it, and then after 9/11 and Afghanistan, and then subsequently Iraq, was compelled to do exactly the way they wanted to. And so Don Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, explained the justification for doing exactly the opposite of what Clinton had finally, after the initial debacles, had done. He said that by flooding Bosnia and Kosovo with international manpower and economic assistance, we had turned those two societies into permanent wards of the international community. And we were going to avoid that in Iraq and Afghanistan by absolutely minimizing commitment of resources. The smallest possible force, least amount of assistance. In Iraq, we said no assistance at all, because that would make them self-sufficient more quickly. Rumsfeld was essentially transposing a domestic debate in the United States in the 1990s about welfare reform to the international realm, and it couldn't have proved a more inapt analogy. The idea that you make a minimal commitment and then reinforce only under failure, only after your initial commitment has failed, only after you've created a power vacuum and then allowed somebody else to fill it, allowed a violent resistance movement to organize and begin to challenge you, turned out to be the most possible expensive way of dealing with these. And so you have this chutes and ladders thing where the administration starts at the works way up the ladder, the next one comes in, you're down at the bottom, and you got to work your way up again. I think Obama largely avoided that by emphasizing a smoother transition, so he kept Bob Gates as Secretary of Defense. He kept General Petraeus in Central Command and then in Afghanistan, who had been finally successful in Iraq. He kept General Lute as the war czar in the National Security Council staff, running both wars from the White House. And so, and he tried to replicate in Afghanistan what Bush had in his second term done in Iraq. Bush also got better, and his second term was much better than his first term. And they were successful finally in stabilizing Iraq, at least temporarily, after many years of failure. And Obama tried to do the same thing, but the country was tired. Obama's heart wasn't really in it. And so he made the mistake that Clinton had made in the beginning, which was setting deadlines. So before you even get there, you say when you're going to leave. And so he put in additional troops, but he announced that they'd only be there for X time, and that he was going to line both of these wars up and leave both of these countries before he left office. And so you go through these learning curves with administrations, particularly when you have presidents who don't have international experience themselves, and particularly when you have changes not only of administrations but of parties. Yeah. So if you have a change of administration and party, the party coming in will automatically discount anything that lasts. So if you're a career president, you go, the one thing you can't say at the meeting is, well, last time we did it this way and it worked.
Right. Yeah, it's in your book, I give you a lot of credit. You had something positive to say about virtually all of the 10 presidents and 13 secretaries of state that you served.
The book was finished before the current administration.
We're going to get to that. And I will say that some of the positive comments were a little bit more positive than others. But this point that you were just talking about, this incredible cost to our ability to devise, structure, implement, and conclude foreign policy initiatives, not just simply wars, but almost anything else, the cost of the way we do transitions here compared to most other countries, some people have said that there are countries that go through violent coups that don't do quite as much change in administration that we do. And then having to go through the inevitable learning curves. It's really nice that, you know, so many administrations on their second terms are doing well, but the carnage getting through the first one is high. Do you have any either fantasy or realistic ideas on how we could smooth some of these transitions and accelerate these learning curves?
Well, I mean, I think you can imagine fixes that would help, but I'm not sure how realistic they are politically. I think the patronage system on which we operate, in which we replace several thousand positions in Washington every 4 or 8 years, and particularly when a change of party accompanies a change of administration, is pretty unique. Now, you can argue that we're a bigger democracy than anybody except India, and that this is a way of tying the country together. It's not just a bunch of mandarins in Washington like you have in Paris or London, and you just change a thin crust at the top. You're actually drawing people from across the country and from across the intellectual and political spectrum into government, giving them an experience, and they go back out. Their party loses, they go back to Brookings or the Heritage Foundation or what. So, but they go back to a background and a certain set of experience, or they go to teach at Georgetown or whatever. And so there's you're educating a broader spectrum of society, you're drawing a broader spectrum. And some of the people who come are extraordinarily good, and sometimes have credentials that a career official would lack in terms of stature, in terms of prior, when you get somebody who's been in the Senate for 15 or 20 years, or Michael Rumsfeld who's been there for like 30 years, and then he becomes ambassador to Japan. You know, that he's carrying a degree of prestige that even the most prestigious career appointment would have. So there's certainly, you know, arguments for it, but it does impose a real burden. New presidents, particularly ones that are not the third term of an existing, you know, party, but a new one, and ones that don't have foreign policy experience, you know, tend to have early mistakes, costly mistakes. You think of Kennedy and the Bay of Pigs. You think of Johnson and the decision to significantly ramp up commitment in Vietnam. You think of Clinton and the Black Hawk Down in Somalia. And of course, the worst mistake of all was George W. Bush's decision to invade Iraq in his second year in office, which we're still paying for. So there's a certain, you know, it's a system based on amateurism, and you pay a price for it. And in terms of what you could do, I mean, I think you could legislate that a certain proportion of the NSC staff had to be professional, which really is, or put differently, that a certain portion of the NSC staff should transition and stay for a year into the new administration, and you know, so they almost always are dominantly professionals. 50% or more usually are professionals, and that's the case in the Trump administration too. After a few lunatics but forcing the kind of Obama transition, where everybody handling the war in Afghanistan and Iraq in the White House was stayed for the first year. Not just one person, everyone. There were no, there was no sudden shift, and that really helped. So you could say, I mean, that's a minor fix, but creating, a stronger cadre of senior officers that move among the national security agencies, perhaps reserving a certain proportion assistant secretaries, undersecretaries for career people. Now that's been done by custom in the State Department. So it's always been the case that the number 3 officer, always at least for the last 50 years, that the number 3 person is a career officer, and more recently there have been 1 or 2 number 2 persons that have been, and there have even been 1 Foreign Service officer, although he wasn't still in the Foreign Service, who became Secretary of State. But if you compare the current system, the patron system, with the first 75 years of the Republic, from George Washington on, every single president for that first quarter, half century or more, was either a successful general or a former Secretary of State who had served abroad as an ambassador. So they all. And now, other than George W. Bush and Eisenhower, nobody has those qualifications. And it's somewhat ironic because the president has almost total control of foreign policy and almost no control over the economy. And yet they invariably get elected for what they can promise to do about the economy, which they cannot do. And not about what they can do internationally, which they can do.
Yeah, I think on this one, not only were the political appointees moved out, and all political appointees, by the way, have to leave at literally the stroke of noon.
Or at least after all.
Yeah. But usually the career people in transition for a while until an administration can get its act together and start changing them. I think with this particular administration, we saw large numbers of career people being moved out before there was even a nomination for a successor. So you end up with these not just gaps in not just learning curves and transitions, but huge gaps. If you had 5 minutes with either Tillerson or McMaster's or Trump, and you can pick which one, what would you most want them to know and to understand?
It's hard. I think McMaster is pretty sophisticated. I'm not sure. I might disagree with him on some points. I think my understanding is that he's more skeptical about the utility of trying to engage the Taliban and his dogs than is the State Department at the moment. So we could have an argument about that. I think his view is we should do that when we're winning, but that might be we might have to wait a long time for that. But I don't know that more generally. I've met him several times, and he has some pretty broad experience. And I think he's coping with a virtually impossible job, but trying to keep his boss on track and out of serious trouble. Tillerson's odd. You would have thought, given his background, well, he doesn't know anything about foreign policy, but he's a really strong manager. What it turns out is his foreign policy seems fine, and he's a terrible manager. It's sort of inexplicable why he's sort of running down the State Department and thinks he has years during which he can undertake a reorganization program. There's a few secretaries of state who want to change the State Department. Most secretaries of state want to change the world, and don't much care about the State Department except as an instrument to change the world, and don't spend a lot of time exploring it. I'd say one exception probably was Colin Powell, who was an institutional guy. He came from a career in the Army, and if you're in the Army, you don't want to fight wars, you just want to improve the Army. So you don't have to fight wars. And so I think he had a bit of that. What can I do to improve the State Department? But most of them, are looking well beyond the State Department and the State Department. They just take it as they find it and leave it pretty much the way they found it. And so I really can't explain, and I'm not sure how I would persuade him that what he's doing is counterproductive. He's eroding his own capacity to project influence and the country's. Now, for those of you who are thinking about a career in the Foreign Service, you're probably a student at a good time. It's a good time not to be in the State Department. But the good news is that by the time you actually enter the State Department, there'll be all kinds of opportunities. Because the top tier will have gone, the bottom tier will have, they're not recruiting, or they're recruiting at very low rates. So 3 or 4 years from now, assuming there's a new administration, they're going to need to recruit a lot of new people, and there's going to be a lot of tough jobs opening.
Yeah, that's the best way you can put it. And there will be an awful lot of very tired mid-level officers who have been trying to do the work of the now departed senior officers and the yet to be recruited junior officers. So you will be very, very much welcome. And then finally, and then we'll turn it open to questions and comments from all of you. At the very end of your book, you described President Obama as reflection without policy, and George W. Bush as policy without reflection.
Right.
How would you like to characterize the current administration?
I'd say an almost complete absence of both. No, seriously. I mean, I think there's something, particularly, I mean, you have the State Department and the White House contradicting each other, and it doesn't mean people say, well, which is the real policy? What people say is there is no policy.
Yeah.
And I think that's generally true, that you simply have a vacuum, and the rest of the world have to operate within this vacuum. They have to fawn on the president and just hope he doesn't say or do something harmful while he's in their country, and operate in the absence of any real interaction, meaningful interaction with Washington, and hope that the best thing, and hope that it doesn't get worse. That is, passivity. There are worse things than passivity, and so having no policy and being essentially passive is better than being actively destructive. And by and large, what they've got is passivity. It's somewhat disguised by flamboyant rhetoric, but it's mostly passivity.
Questions and comments from anyone here? Yes, sir.
My name is you mentioned Iraq as being a very bad mistake. It's not a bad mistake to make was not to intervene, say, in Rwanda when that was happening. And the Clinton administration being apprehensive of foreign entanglements following the debacle in Somalia was reluctant to recognize the unfolding genocide and what was happening there, and decided not to do anything. So following the massacres in Rwanda and Srebrenica, you had the so-called R2P initiative, a responsibility to protect, as you know well, which essentially stipulated guidelines on when it is, in fact, necessary for states to intervene humanitarily. And then in the next decade, you did have better interventions like the attempts to bring democracy to the Middle East, and then most recently perhaps attempts to bring democracy to Russia's neighborhood, which also backfired. So the constant question for the US foreign policy of how to combine the American ideals with the realist policies.
Sure.
How do you think the balance in between those two has to be amended or rethought in the light of the last 2 decades?
Well, I think that the evolving attitude on humanitarian interventions, and particularly the right to protect doctrine that was announced by a global summit involving the heads of state for 170 or something, provides a rationale for intervention, but it provides, if you will, a rationale or a justification for intervention, but it doesn't provide a sufficient reason to intervene. I think you need to have some combination, as a practical matter, of having a rationale, having a justification, and having a national interest engaged that will justify domestically the costs, the risks of an intervention. Now, you mentioned Rwanda. The Clinton administration did make a decision to intervene at that very moment. And I can tell you personally, I was working on Rwanda. I got a call saying, we're going to invade Haiti. We want you to lead the diplomacy that would allow us to invade Haiti. And I said, well, I'm doing Rwanda. Can I do them both? And I said, no, we're invading Haiti. We're not doing Rwanda. So that was a decision. And the answer was there were human rights violations in both countries. Rwanda was more serious. But the refugees weren't coming to Florida. The refugees from Haiti were washing up on the beaches in southern Florida. And so we had a humanitarian case in both cases. We weren't going to invade both countries. And we chose Haiti. Now you can argue, and Clinton has since argued, that this was a mistake. But the fact is we left Somalia with our tail between our legs only 3 weeks earlier. And we weren't going back to Africa in something that looked a lot like Somalia, not that long. So, and so we did Haiti. And then we did Bosnia, and then we did Kosovo. And Kosovo was bad in '95, but we decided we couldn't do Bosnia and Kosovo at the same time. And so the Kosovars were just going to have to live with Milosevic and Serb persecution for another 5 years until we got around to them. Because, you know, it was one at a time was the Clinton administration's view. Unfortunately, it wasn't the Bush administration's view. Bush administration had just invaded Afghanistan and not Iraq. We would have done a lot better off. Now, I think that neither Afghanistan nor Iraq were justified as R2P humanitarian interventions. You know, the first one was just a response to an attack, and the second one was weapons of mass destruction, and that sort of thing. So they really don't have much to say about whether R2P is responsibility to protect is operative or useful. It was certainly used to justify the intervention in Libya, which was successful within its narrow parameters, but there wasn't enough follow-through, and you can argue that the situation in Libya is a lot worse post-Gaddafi than it was while Gaddafi was there. And you should have just let him slaughter a few people and at least take over the country again, rather than intervene and let the country descend into chaos. So, you know, one of the lessons is if you're not going to follow through on these things, you know, it's better not to get involved at all. Personally, I argued for an early intervention in Syria, basically just taking out the Syrian Air Force in 2011 when the Syrian regime was losing on the ground and was only in the air that it had superiority, and where we could have done it overnight with pro-American casualties in all likelihood, and where it would have changed the dynamic, and where the opposition that was winning was not radicalized, was not. But today, my view is the quicker Assad wins, the better, and we shouldn't be doing anything to obstruct it, and we should provide reconstruction assistance once it's done, because our principal interest is the Syrians go home, they stop destabilizing all the neighboring countries, and you begin to calm down the region. So there's, you know, I mean, I think that the humanitarian case is a case that, but it's not. It doesn't create a requirement. It creates a rationale to do something that also has to be in your national interest, and if it's going to be international, it has to be in a lot of people's national interest.
Yes.
Okay, so my question, I have multiple questions.
Okay.
I'm going to condense it down.
Condense it way down. Negative question, not a speech.
Okay. Question one. Who decided to pick Karzai as the president of Afghanistan during the Bonn agreement? And question two is...
I'll buy the book.
Yeah,
I'll answer it.
And question two is, in regards to Afghanistan right now, what do you think is the best way to create stability in that region with regards to all of the issues going on with Pakistan and the Taliban? Okay.
When people give me two questions, I never remember the second. I'm not going to do it, but I'll try. So So I was sort of leading the diplomacy in the aftermath of 9/11 to put together an Afghan government. And we didn't have any particular favor. What we wanted was, and we didn't want to have to govern Afghanistan. So we wanted a substitute for the Taliban that would be immediately available as soon as the Taliban were defeated. And so, working with the UN, we and the UN in particular collected a cross-section of Afghan opposition to the Taliban, most of whom were emigres who did opposition abroad, at a conference in Bonn. Now, one of the four groups there was the group that was fighting in Afghanistan, so they were not emigres. And they had been fighting since the Taliban had come. So there was a counter-Taliban insurgency throughout the Taliban period. It was small, and it had been largely marginalized, but it was fighting. And the impression most Americans have is that after 9/11, we put together a coalition and defeated the Taliban. The truth is, we joined a coalition that had been fighting for 5 years. And the addition of American air power allowed that coalition to prevail. And that coalition was made up of the Northern Alliance, Afghans, Iran, who became implicitly our partner, Russia, and India. Those were the countries that were backing the Northern Alliance. And we stepped in and joined that coalition, in effect. And that coalition joined us in Bonn and helped us create the Karzai government. Now, so I, in preparation for that, went around to a number of different countries. And the first person to say Karzai would be a good choice to head this was the head of the Pakistani intelligence service. So I put, okay, that's interesting. The next person was the foreign minister of the Northern Alliance, who had been fighting the Pakistani intelligence service for the last 5 years. Pakistanis were supporting the Taliban. And he also said Karzai would be a good nominee. We could accept Karzai. We know we're going to control all the cities, but we're prepared to give up power, or we're prepared to share power. And we recognize that we probably need a Pashtun rather than a Tajik or an Uzbek to run the country. So why not Karzai? So I said, oh, this is not going to be as hard as I thought. And then the Turks suggested Karzai. Then in Bonn, the Russians suggested Karzai. The Iranians suggested Karzai. And the Indians suggested Karzai. So, I wondered at this, and I later learned that it was the Afghan Northern Alliance Foreign Minister Abdullah, who had gone to all those countries and planted Karzai. And so that's what was agreed. There was some back and forth, and there were some other people in Bonn who wanted to be the president. We had to sort of move them aside. But it was a genuine. It was essentially the Northern Alliance knew that they had to find somebody who wasn't one of them to lead, and thought Karzai was broadly acceptable, young, hadn't made any enemies, and had good relations externally. He'd been traveling around during the Taliban period, meeting people in Washington and elsewhere, so he was a known quality. And he was a good choice. Over time, he became more problematic, partially because of the way we handled him. But for his first term, he was an ideal candidate, and did a good job.
Yes, ma'am.
Oh, so the second question?
Oh, yes. Sorry.
In regards to
what should we do?
creating, how can we?
I mean, I think what Trump decided was basically sound. It was what I and others were urging Obama to do in 2014, which was essentially, we're not going to surge and have 100,000 troops and win the war, but we don't want to lose the war. And therefore, you're going to have to keep a modicum of American troops that can provide advice and support to the Afghans, not just at headquarters, but in the field. And that's probably somewhere around between 10 and 15,000 troops, and then another 5,000 or 6,000 non-American European troops. And Obama essentially rejected our advice and chose to continue or draw down to zero by the end of his administration. Now, 3 weeks after he announced that decision, the Islamic State burst out of Syria and marched to the gates of Baghdad, and the consequences of leaving a war half finished became more apparent. And I knew Obama was never going to actually carry through on his promise, which he didn't. But he did hold down the levels below what we thought was wise. So I think Trump, despite some Trumpian flourishes to his announcement, which I didn't take very seriously, essentially did what the State Department and the Defense Department did, which was put an American advisory force in there that was, and give it sufficient scope to support the Afghans to a degree that would allow them to fight this war to a stalemate, and then try to negotiate a peace settlement. And that's where we are now. I mean, Trump only had 2 choices. He didn't have 3. His choices were lose or not lose. He didn't have the win choice.
It's easy for him.
His original inclination was to lose, that is to leave. And he was persuaded that he'd rather not lose.
Okay, yes, ma'am.
I was just wondering, having had this much experience in the Foreign Service, what's the most rewarding aspect of your work here right now?
Well, it's a lot. You have to buy the book. I mean, I think there's several Foreign Service officers here, so they may feel that. I think there's sort of 2 kinds of Foreign Service officers. There's Foreign Service officers who join the Foreign Service to live abroad, to experience foreign cultures, and to observe and report on them. And there's people who join in order to make foreign policy. Many of them don't even like foreigners and don't want to serve abroad. They want to make foreign policy and they prefer to stay in Washington. Whereas the other kind of Foreign Service who never wants to come to Washington, tries to avoid it and will try to stay abroad. Now, to succeed, you have to be good at both. I mean, if you only want to do one of these 2 things, you'll have a mediocre career. So, because your reputation will be made in Washington, basically. And if you don't succeed in Washington, you're not going to get high-profile assignments, and so you'll top out somewhere in the middle. So you have to be good at both. But still, there are 2 different preferences. I was of the one that wanted to make foreign policy, and of course that brings its own frustrations because they don't let you make foreign policy. At least they don't let you make a lot of foreign policy. The political appointees think they want to make foreign policy, and you're supposed to execute it. But there's enough scope, so the things that there were points in my life where family life and work. 4 years in Bonn, an idyllic post on the Rhine, with a big house and 5 servants, and supervising 1,500 people in the biggest U.S. mission in the world. That was great. But coming back and doing the diplomacy that reunified Germany was even greater. Yeah.
I will underscore, I think it's a combination of both.
Yeah.
It's if you just want to go and live abroad and experience cultures, join the Peace Corps. If you just want to do foreign policy as a chess game, join the civil service. Or go to Brookings or something. You have to be willing and able and interested in doing both.
Yeah.
And understand that you do make foreign policy abroad, and you have to understand abroad in order to make foreign policy in Washington. And so that ability to flip back and forth and to understand that both of them have wonderful benefits and enormous frustrations on both sides.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Following up on the lady's comment about the Foreign Service, you've made a comment before about the impact of being in a small post, for instance, on your career. And I wonder if we can talk about that for a moment.
Sure.
Given your illustrious career, 50 years, sure, some things are luck, where right time, right place, but 50 years in a successful career is not an accident. So I'm curious if you could share with us maybe some tips, techniques, best practices that you've developed over the years that you might impart on us, or either in the Foreign Service or aspire to it, that might work for us, things to avoid, things that might work for us.
I mean, it's hard. I remember one advice I was given, it was my first post, I guess, and I was in Paris, and I left the Vietnam delegation. I was working in the embassy, and the ambassador was Sergeant Schreiber, who was the brother-in-law of John Kennedy, and founder of the Peace Corps, and he was ambassador to Paris, and he was interested in youth, and sort of made a thing and youth was sort of taken seriously at that point. It was 1968. They almost overthrown the French government, and so suddenly, you know, people were taking it a little more seriously. Anyway, so I was his assistant for youth affairs, and so one of my ideas was that all of the senior officers in the embassy, the heads of sections, all of whom had big houses and one or two servants, you know, should each give a youth event every month. And the ambassador thought it was a great idea, and the senior officer thought it was absolutely terrible. You know, they knew that winning over French youth one at a time was not, you know, was not a productive use of and particularly not of their evenings. And the deputy chief of mission, a more senior foreign service officer, said, you know, you're doing a great job, Jim. This is just what the ambassador is. But remember, you're going to have to work and live with these people for the next several days. and so, you know, so curb your enthusiasm is implicit advice. And so partly it's that you're in a career service where the people you rub up against and maybe defeat in that day's bureaucratic battle are people you're going to be partnered with or working with multiple times in your career. And so that's one lesson. Now you can take that too far and just be a nice guy and never get anything done because you don't want to offend anyone. So you have to counterbalance that. The other is, I mean, I think you need to really enjoy what you're doing. Put your enthusiasm, your real. I mean, make it. If you're not coming home at the end of the day feeling that you've achieved something, you've done something, even if it's just get some cable cleared by 17 bureaus so it can go out, you know, that they come home and say, well, I really did something today. And so if you're not getting that, you know, then maybe you're in the wrong career or you're in the wrong job. But if you have that sense and that sense that whatever you're doing is really I mean, almost, with only a few exceptions, every job I had was the best job I ever had. And so I treated each of them as if it was the best job I ever had.
Yeah. I used to treat every one of my positions as, if this is the end of my career, I want it to be the most important and the most successful and the most interesting one that I had. That if this is the end, I want this to be a good end. And then you turn around and one day you just hit, I only got to 33 years.
Yes, so I have a quick question. You mentioned earlier that current administration has a very passive foreign policy. What do you think that does to our interests abroad, the U.S. interests abroad?
Well, I mean, I think it...
Or influence?
I mean, it certainly diminishes our influence, and over time it will erode our interests. I mean, so far we haven't, rather extraordinarily, given the lack of experience on the part of the president, we haven't had the kinds of Bay of Pigs invading Iraq disaster that, and in some ways it's remarkable that we've gotten through 8 or 9 months at this point without a major disaster. But I mean, I think there's certainly an erosion of influence, and events could spin out of control. I mean, there are some countries that wish us ill, but most countries don't wish us ill. Most countries want us to have a more effective foreign policy. And most countries are distressed that I mean, even countries like China would like us to be more active on the climate change area, for instance. And certainly our European and Asian partners would like a more active, more engaged the United States. So it's not necessarily that they're going to take advantage of this passivity, but it will mean that we'll miss opportunities.
Yes, sir.
I guess I'm Constantine. I'm a first-year student in German European Studies, part of SDS. I have a question about former Yugoslavia. Extrapolating what we know and what's the current situation toward 10, 20, 30 years ahead, do you think that strategic U.S. maneuver in changing the strategic partners in the region and would be a possibility for resolving some crises that are ongoing in the region? I primarily mean, should Serbia, for example, decide to join the NATO, would that be a possible trade-off that Serbia could get in that new constellation? Again, in order to resolve the crisis in Bosnia, for example, the ongoing instability of political regime.
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, the United States has largely turned Yugoslavia and the Balkans over to the European Union. So there is a peacekeeping force in Bosnia, and it's exclusively European, and it's not very big. We still have troops in Kosovo as part of the NATO. So I don't have the sense that the administration is paying much attention. In fact, I'm pretty sure they're not paying any attention to what's going on in the Balkans. I'm not sure what you mean by, I mean, I don't think we can give Serbia back Kosovo, or for that matter, the Republic of Srpska, in exchange for them throwing over the Russians and becoming an ally of the United States. We don't care whether it's not. I think what we want is a peaceful Balkans, and that's really all we want from the Balkans. And we don't have other sort of broader geopolitical interests or aspirations for the Balkans if they just don't kill each other and adhere essentially to the current borders and arrangements. If they're inefficiently governed and are not making as much progress as they might otherwise, that's kind of their problem, and it's the European Union's problem, not ours. So I'm not. I mean, there are. I just read a paper today that the Council on Foreign Relations has released, arguing that the Balkans are about to fall apart again, and we really need to be more heavily engaged. And the administration ought to make a big commitment to the Balkans. I think that's most unlikely. And I'm hopeful that they're wrong about the projection.
Yes, sir.
That actually kind of flows a little bit into my question, specifically Russia. As we've seen recently, they've been reasserting themselves not only regionally but globally. Their kind of aspirations to be on as a kind of equal power, at least in their eyes, to the U.S. have definitely been driving them to move forward with a lot of aggressive action, starting off from Georgia and then eventually in Crimea and Ukraine, what we're seeing right now. And then even to the point where they're projecting even further and getting involved in elections and tampering and that sort of thing. How would you recommend moving forward, or what would your advice be to our current decision makers and policymakers as to how to deal with the kind of rising Russia?
Well, I mean, I think the current administration is pretty paralyzed, largely by differences between the President and the Secretary of State, and between us and our allies, and the whole Russia investigation, the special prosecutor, all of it, sort of make any meaningful diplomacy with Russia very difficult. And so I think that under other conditions there are deals to be made with the Russians on Syria, I think, and there has been some conversations between the administration and the Russians on Syria, and those should be pursued, and under ideal circumstances, there might be more that could be done to stabilize and end that conflict. There are potential deals that could theoretically be made that would get the Russians out, at least out of eastern Ukraine. I don't think you get them out of Crimea anytime soon. And those deals would be worth doing. I think on the election interference and the general Russian efforts to subvert the democratic processes, not just in the United States, but across Europe. I think it needs pretty substantial pushback, probably more substantial than they've had so far. And we probably need to threaten to do the same thing to them. I think a credible threat to destabilize their system and stage a color revolution in Moscow, which is probably not realistic as an American aspiration, but it's Putin's greatest fear. And I think threatening to do that would be a good way of getting them to back off from some of their recent behavior. So it's a combination of a tougher line on some things and a more accommodating line on others. I think it was a mistake to bring in countries bordering the Soviet Union into NATO, particularly bordering Russia into NATO. I don't think we should have moved into the former Soviet space. I think those countries could have existed as neutrals, just like Austria and Switzerland and Finland and Sweden did throughout the Cold War. And I don't think they added anything to our security. So I think that was a mistake. And it was an even greater mistake to insist that Ukraine was going to be a member of NATO back at a time when most Ukrainians didn't want to be a member of NATO. I mean, why we were pushing this against the view of most Ukrainians, always mystified me. And those initiatives under the George W. Bush administration led directly to the Russian interventions, first in Georgia and then in Ukraine. So there are deals to be made there, but I don't think they'll be made by this administration.
Okay, last question, this gentleman back here.
President Trump just finished his Asia tour. So what's your view on Sino-US relations and US policy towards this region, Asia?
That's a big question, but I don't pretend to be an expert on China. I think first of all, that the actual clash of interest between the U.S. and China are pretty limited. A few rocks in the South China Sea, the future of Taiwan, with neither country trying to upset the current arrangement, just being nervous that the current arrangement can't last forever because the Taiwanese will do something stupid. That's pretty much it. We have pretty much coincident views on North Korea. By and large, the United States is not objecting to and sees some advantage to the Chinese One Belt, One Road, essentially developmental projects, particularly in Central Europe. Not Central Europe, in Central Asia, and could be very helpful in Afghanistan if they move very far. When I was in the Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, I had a number of discussions with them about Pakistan. And I think my view, and I think their view, was Pakistan is so broken that the more countries that are trying to prop it up, the better. And so we're not, you don't compete to aid a failing state. And so we saw China's willingness to invest in and bolster Pakistan is not counter to U.S. interests. Clearly, we're economic competitors. China isn't exporting Maoism. It's not exporting a particular particular ideology. My view is the Chinese think they're so special that they don't necessarily believe that it is exportable, the Chinese model, as opposed to the Russians who were exporting a model. I could be wrong about that, but my sense is that we're not in an ideological competition. There's a competition. We promote democracy. China's promoting, or at least resisting that. But it's not the Cold War type of binary competition, and it's largely economic, and it's largely a win-win potential. So I think there are flashpoints: Taiwan, Korea, South China Sea, a couple of other even less likely flashpoints, and we ought to be doing our best to disarm these. We ought to be. China is going to be even a more powerful competitor in the future. And so to the extent we can remove sources of friction and remove areas where we could come into conflict, we, the United States, are better off doing it now while we're still the dominant power than waiting 20 years and trying to do it then when China will be in a much stronger position. So I do advocate an effort to engage and try to settle or resolve the differences with China in areas, particularly the South China Sea, where American interests are pretty marginal.
Thank you very much. That was terrific. Yes, it was a pleasure. I don't get any royalties from this, so I can say quite candidly, I do recommend the book 50 Years, Foreign Service 50 Years. I think you'll find it an enjoyable read. Both the substance, going through so many of these critical foreign policy issues, and for those who are looking at careers in global public service, answering some of the questions that you had as well. I think the book is a great look into that as well. So I get no royalties.
Neither do I.
Neither do you. So it's a book I recommend, and you can read it on your plane ride home for Thanksgiving.
Yeah, just go to Amazon and see if you can get it.
Yeah. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.